I remember the day clearly, not because of anything grand or newsworthy, but because it was so unexpectedly quiet. The kind of quiet that creeps into your bones and makes you listen to things you've ignored for too long, like the beat of your own heart. I was waiting at a gas station just outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, a place with rusty pumps and a faded Coca-Cola sign that hadn't been swapped out since the 80s. I'd driven there on instinct more than purpose, chasing a hunch I couldn't quite explain. But I wasn't alone. In fact, the man I was about to meet had once been the loudest voice in the world. That he arrived in a black SUV, the kind that whispered power and whispered it loudly. No motorcade. No press. Just one driver who stepped out first, glanced around, and then opened the door for him. Donald Trump. Former President of the United States. He wore a navy coat buttoned too tight across the middle, his expression unreadable beneath a red baseball cap. He looked tired. Not physically, but in a deeper, less visible way. He didn't say anything right away. Just nodded, as if I were the one who'd summoned him, though neither of us had actually made contact for over 3 decades that we drove in silence. He sat in the passenger seat beside me, staring straight ahead. No aids. No phone. No rehearsed lines. The road narrowed as we left town behind, winding into the countryside until it was just trees, shadows, and the soft whine of gravel under the tires. I could feel him watching the landscape like it might tell him something he'd forgotten. He still lives out here? Trump asked at last, his voice a little raspier than I remembered. He never left, I replied, and that was all we said for another 20 minutes. Until we reached the house that it was modest, almost collapsing under the weight of decades. The paint peeled like sunburned skin. A flagpole leaned slightly, the stars and stripes faded but unbowed. I parked under the single oak tree that had likely seen more seasons than either of us would. Trump stepped out first, and he walked slower than I'd seen him move in the past. Not from frailty but caution. The kind of caution that comes when you revisit something you've tried hard to forget. He adjusted his collar, looked up at the screen door, and took a breath, then he knocked. That I stayed behind, watching from the car. The man who answered the door was leaner now, older, but unmistakable. A veteran who'd once shared a piece of jungle with Trump during a visit to Vietnam. The public never knew about that stop. It had been arranged quietly, under pressure, and it hadn't gone well. But something happened there, something only they remembered. Something that hadn't let either of them go. There was no handshake. Just 2 men standing across a threshold, locked in an exchange of unsaid words. Then, the door opened wider, Trump stepped inside, and the door closed. That I waited in the car for nearly an hour, wondering what ghosts were being exorcised behind that screen, what truths were being passed across the kitchen table. The house remained still, its windows blank and silent. But I knew something was shifting inside. When he returned, Trump didn't look at me right away. He just got in the car, pulled the door shut, and exhaled slowly. He forgave me, he said quietly. That I didn't ask for what, because sometimes, when silence is all that remains, the truth doesn't need to be spoken. That we drove back the same way we'd come, the sun dipping low behind us, and for the first time in years, he didn't reach for his phone. The drive back was quiet at first, the kind of silence that doesn't press but lingers, like dust in sunlight. I didn't ask questions. He didn't offer details. We passed the same hills, same rusted fences, same crooked mailbox where we'd once seen a boy waving at us like he recognized the man in the passenger seat. This time, no one waved. The world had shrunk in the span of an hour. Then, as we merged back onto the main road, he spoke. It wasn't about politics, he said. It never was. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. He wasn't talking to me, not really. He was voicing something aloud for the first time, not to be heard, but to make it real. We were in Da Nang, he continued. 68, I wasn't supposed to be there long. Some diplomatic photo op, you know. Smile for the troops, shake a few hands, fly back before anyone noticed. He glanced out the window, then back at the road. But the chopper was delayed. Weather or something. They stuck me with a unit for the night, said I'd be safer with boots on the ground than in the air. I kept my eyes forward. His voice had shifted, less performative, more reflective. I could tell this wasn't a rehearsed story. This wasn't campaign trail nostalgia. This was raw. He didn't like me from the start, Trump went on, meaning the veteran. Didn't like how I looked. Thought I was some spoiled rich boy playing soldier. He wasn't wrong. A short laugh escaped him, bitter and dry. There was a mortar attack. Middle of the night. Sirens, shouting. Chaos. I froze. I mean really froze. Everyone around me moving like ghosts, like they were born for it. And I just stood there, trying to remember how to breathe. He turned slightly in his seat, watching me now, and he grabbed me. Pulled me down. Covered me with his own body until it passed. Trump paused. The SUV hummed beneath us, smooth and constant. I never said thank you. Not really. When it was over, I left. Told myself it didn't mean anything. Told myself he probably forgot too. But he didn't, I said, finally. He shook his head. No. He didn't. We stopped at a red light near a diner. Through the window I saw a woman wiping down a counter, flipping chairs up onto tables. The world kept turning. Quietly. Indifferently. You know what he said to me in there? Trump asked, voice lower now. I didn't answer. He said he never hated me. Said what he hated was the way I turned that moment into silence. Said I'd lived 100 lives since then, built towers, won elections, lost them, fought the world, and through it all, I never once looked back. He rubbed his thumb against the edge of his seatbelt like it was sandpaper. He said forgiveness wasn't about making peace with someone else. It was about remembering who you were before the lies. The light turned green. We drove another mile before he added, and then he gave me a photo. His hand reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Slowly, carefully, he pulled out a worn black and white picture. Folded 3 times, the edges frayed. I didn't look directly at it, but I saw enough. A young soldier, cigarette between his teeth, hand on the shoulder of another man. The second figure's face was blurred by time, but I knew who it was. I forgot this existed, he said. Seeing it, it made me wonder if maybe he remembered more of me than I remembered of myself. We pulled into the same gas station where this had started. The sun was nearly gone now, the sky bleeding into purple. He didn't move to get out right away. I didn't come here to apologize, Trump said. I came to understand why I've felt unfinished for so damn long. He looked up, meeting my eyes, and I think I do now. Then he opened the door and stepped out. No final words. No dramatic exits. Just a man, older than he ever thought he'd feel, walking back toward the SUV that had brought him here. His driver was waiting. As he reached the vehicle, he paused and turned. One last time. Do me a favor, he said. Yeah. Don't tell this story like I was the hero. I nodded. I won't. And with that, he climbed inside, the door shutting with a soft, inevitable click. The SUV pulled away slowly, taillights dissolving into the evening, and I stood there alone, realizing that the story I had just witnessed wasn't about redemption. It was about the weight a man carries when no one's looking. By the next morning, the story hadn't broken, but the silence felt thinner. I could sense it, like a low pressure before a storm. Back in New York, the streets moved faster, colder. Trump's schedule resumed, but something in him hadn't. He walked slower, paused longer. And for the first time in memory, he refused interviews. That alone set people whispering. The inner circle noticed. Of course they did. An aide asked why he disappeared for 2 days. He didn't answer. He waved it off with a grunt and retreated into his office. For hours, the door remained shut. Inside, he sat at his desk, not working, not plotting. Just holding that photograph. He'd unfolded it again and again, fingers tracing outlines of the past like they were cracks in a foundation he'd never repaired. That photo became a weight. Not just an object, but a reminder. Of silence. Of debt. Of the version of himself he never let the world see. By noon, a call came through. A journalist, one of the few he used to trust, wanted to verify a strange tip. A witness saw you in rural Pennsylvania. Said you were visiting a vet who served in Vietnam. You want to comment? He didn't respond, not yet. Instead, he did something uncharacteristic that he went alone. No press. No staff. No car waiting. That he walked 6 blocks to a bench by the East River. Sat down. Pulled his coat tighter. Watched the barges drift under a pale sky. And just Saturday I watched from a distance. I always kept track, even when the story wasn't meant for paper. He didn't know I was there. Or maybe he did and didn't care. The wind picked up. A plastic bag tumbled across the sidewalk, chasing its own shadow. He stared at the water like it owed him answers. Finally, he reached into his coat again. Not for the photo this time, for a pen and an envelope that he began to write, slowly. Methodically. No speechwriters. No dictation. Just pen to paper, as if the act itself demanded honesty. When he finished, he sat with it for a moment. Then he stood, walked toward the nearest post box, and dropped the envelope inside. That letter would never be leaked. I'd never learn what it said. But I know where it was headed. Back to that peeling house beneath the oak, back to the man who'd once pulled him from the dirt in a forgotten war. Trump returned to his apartment that evening quieter than ever. And as he passed his reflection in the hallway mirror, he paused, stared, not to fix his tie, but as if trying to see something deeper beneath the skin. Something not everyone gets to reclaim. Meanwhile, across the state, an old man retrieved his mail. Stood on his porch under a fading sky. Held an envelope in hands that trembled more than they used to. He didn't smile. Didn't speak. Just opened the door and stepped back inside, because some apologies don't need to be read aloud, they just need to arrive. Weeks passed. The media, hungry as ever, eventually moved on. They chased newer outrages, brighter scandals. The rumor about Trump's mysterious trip to Pennsylvania faded like fog off the Hudson. No confirmation, no photos. Just the whisper of something almost human, but I hadn't moved on. I kept watching, not out of curiosity, but because I sensed a change. Not in the man's image, but in his rhythm. He still held meetings. Still gave statements. But now and then, I'd see it, a hesitation before a signature, a long pause in front of a news crew, the way his eyes lingered on a face in the crowd a second too long. Like he was looking for something behind the moment. Then one afternoon, an invitation arrived. No return address. Just my name. Inside, a folded card with an embossed seal I recognized immediately. Not official. Personal. One line, come see something. I drove to the edge of Queens, a stretch of warehouses and private lots most people wouldn't look at twice. I found the address near an old rail yard. A metal gate half opened, as if someone had been expecting hesitation. Inside stood Trump, alone again. No suit this time. Work gloves. Rolled up sleeves. Dust on his shoes. Behind him, a building under renovation. The signage hadn't been installed yet, but I saw enough to guess what it would become. A center for veterans. Private. Quiet. Not a non-profit. Not a campaign gesture. Something else. That he looked at me and didn't smile. This is where he served. After he came home, Trump said that I knew who he meant. No one ever fixed it up, he added. No one cared. We walked inside. Drywall halfway up. Exposed wiring. Sawdust in the air. He pointed to a corner room. That's where they'll hold counseling sessions. Another room, reading space. No TV. No politics. Just peace. I didn't ask why he brought me. Maybe he didn't know. Or maybe he knew too well. Before I could speak, he looked at me with that same unreadable gaze he'd worn on the road to the veteran's house. I'm not changing, he said. Let's not pretend I am. I nodded. I believed him. But this is something that doesn't need a crowd to matter. And then he handed me another envelope. Smaller. Sealed. Give this to him, he said. Next time you go. I held it for a second. It felt heavier than it should have. You think he'll want it? I asked. Trump looked away. Doesn't matter what he wants. It matters that I send it. And that was the only truth that hung in the air after .no staff came to collect him. No cameras followed. He walked back into the building with the ease of someone who wasn't fixing a legacy, but returning to something he'd once refused to face. Later that week, I drove back to Pennsylvania. The oak tree was bare now. Leaves scattered like forgotten medals across the yard. That I knocked on the same door. The veteran answered. That he didn't look surprised. That he just nodded when I handed him the envelope. That we sat on the porch for a while. No talk of war. No talk of presidents, just two men and the long hush of dusk. When he finally opened the letter, he didn't read it aloud, but he folded it slowly. Held it to his chest. And closed his eyes, and for the first time, I understood. Some debts aren't repaid in money or gestures. They're repaid in memory. In silence. In something left unsaid, but deeply felt. Months had passed since the letter, and the world had returned to its familiar noise. Elections loomed, pundits howled, and the machinery of image kept grinding. Trump was, in many ways, back in form, his voice louder, his movements sharper. But I knew better. Not because he told me. Because I had watched the silence work on him like water on stone. The center opened without ceremony. No ribbon cutting, no televised tours. Just an open door and a weathered plaque, for those who never asked for applause. It sat tucked between warehouses and railroad lines, but word spread fast in quiet circles. Veterans came not because they were told to, but because they heard it was safe. No cameras. No judgment. Just shelter, and once a week, without fail, a black SUV would pull up just before closing. That he never entered during hours. Never interrupted. He'd walk the halls only after everyone left, his steps slow, deliberate. Once, I followed without asking. He paused in front of a corkboard where handwritten notes from visiting veterans hung like prayer flags. One caught his eye. I never saw what it said, but he stood there longer than usual. When he turned, I asked him what he saw. That he didn't answer right away. Then finally, something I missed for 50 years. He didn't elaborate. I didn't press, because I had come to understand that some stories didn't need to be told in full. Their power wasn't in the detail, but in the shift they left behind. That was the last time I saw him at the center. After that, the visit stopped. The news said he was preparing for a major speech. Something big. A return. People speculated, a campaign. A new party. Another book, but I knew better. I'd seen the wear in his eyes that even makeup couldn't mask. The kind of wear that doesn't come from age or pressure, but from letting go of something you held too tightly for too long. Then, one cold morning in December, I received a call from a name I hadn't heard in years. The veteran. He didn't say much. Just, you might want to come out here. I drove in silence. When I arrived, he stood on the porch, same as before. But something in his posture told me this wasn't about a visit. It was about an ending. That we didn't speak as I stepped inside. He handed me a folded sheet of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a copy of a draft, something written by Trump in his own hand. I recognized the sharp, uneven script. The top, for the day I no longer need to speak. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a political document. It was something else entirely. A reflection written for no audience. A man confronting himself, not the world. He'd sent it weeks earlier. Said it was something the world didn't need now, but might someday. The veteran had been holding on to it, unsure whether to share, but now, he handed it to me. He said nothing, and I took it with the kind of care you reserve for things heavier than paper. That night, I sat alone and read it. It spoke of legacy, not the kind written in stone or steel, but in the people we touch and never meet again. It spoke of fear, not of losing, but of being remembered for the wrong reasons. It spoke of silence, not as weakness, but as a final strength, and at the end, a single line. Stood alone. I was never the man they thought I was. But in one moment, someone saw the man I might have been. That's enough. He signed it not with his title, not even with his full name, just, Donald. The draft was never published. The world spun on, hungry for sound bites and spectacle, but I knew where that paper belonged. A week later, I returned to the center. Quiet as always. I framed the page, not in gold, not behind glass. Just wood. Simple. Solid, and I placed it in the reading room, behind the last row of books, where sunlight touched it only in the late afternoon. No one pointed it out. No one needed to, because the men and women who came here, they knew what it meant to carry a memory alone. As for the veteran, he never mentioned the letter again, but I noticed he stood straighter now, the kind of posture you see when a burden has shifted, even if just slightly. And Trump, he returned to the stage eventually. The spotlight found him again, as it always does, but for those of us who'd seen what was left when the lights dimmed, there was another chapter, a quiet one, unsung, unseen, and maybe that was the only one that mattered, because in a forgotten house, under a bent flagpole and a tired oak, a man once pulled another from the ground, and 50 years later, the debt was returned not with fanfare, but with silence.